Venez, mes chers confrères, venez pour écouter une chanson bien faite d'un nommé McCarthy.
That was the opening line from a once very famous French folk song called Le Meurtre de Timothy McCarthy, which means the murder of Timothy McCarthy. This rather lengthy folk song recounts the true story of the mysterious disappearance of a wealthy innkeeper from Moncton. Strangely enough, this kind of 10-minute long folk song acts as like a Yelp review of the time, basically giving this particular hotel 0 out of 5 stars and warning that if you stay there, you might be killed. And the song ends by warning its listeners to be careful because the killers of Timothy McCarthy were still on the loose. Officially, what happened to Timothy McCarthy remains unsolved today, but in this episode, we're going to piece together what happened to him to try and solve this nearly 150-year-old mystery. The first suggestion that something had happened to Timothy McCarthy came in an ad that his brother paid to take out in a local newspaper shortly after his disappearance, which read,
Missing man, Timothy McCarthy, tavern keeper of Moncton. Left his house Friday, the 12th of October, drove his own horse to Shediac, put up at Weldon House Hotel and Bar, left the horse there and disappeared. He had some money on him at the time. Height, 5 feet 10 inches. Dark hair. Eyes, light gray. Weight, 200 pounds. Any information would be gladly received by his wife or his brother. Signed, Edward McCarthy, Moncton, November 3rd, 1877.
You're listening to Backyard History, the hidden stories that happened in your own backyard. The podcast version of the weekly history column running in newspapers across the Maritimes. With your host and author, Andrew McLean.
It has now been 25 days since Mr. McCarthy's disappearance. Inquiries have been made in every direction, but no tidings have been received of his whereabouts, nor can he be traced beyond Shediac. His family, relatives, and friends are naturally greatly excited over the event and fear that he has been the victim of foul play.
That was written by George Sumner, who was the lone reporter for Moncton's only newspaper. Moncton is today the second largest city in the Maritimes, but by 1877, which is when this story takes place, Moncton was still very small, and it was only home to about 600 people. It was definitely not a place that was doing well. Just a few years earlier, it had twice as many people, but now it was a shell of itself. It was a ghost town. This place had no police force, which is why George Sumner, who was the only reporter for a local 4-page long Moncton newspaper called the Daily Times, decided to try and solve the mystery of a missing man all by himself. He wrote that
Timothy McCarthy, as many of our readers are aware, kept a tavern and hotel on Main Street. Mr. McCarthy was a buff, hearty man, well calculated to make and retain friends. He was above average in stoutness and weight. His face had a fresh, healthy look, and altogether he would be considered fairly good-looking. It is well known that Mr. McCarthy, who was personally quite popular, drove a thriving business, making money rapidly. Mr. McCarthy did not leave in such a way to justify people in supposing that he intended to remain long when he left on the 12th of October. He gave out that he was going to Prince Edward Island, but no person saw him leave Shediac.
The reporter then called for anyone who knew anything to come forward. Soon, though, George Sumner found that
most of the street reports in regard to the matter are wholly unreliable.
And so, this reporter decided to go to the little seaside resort town of Shediac to investigate the missing man's disappearance for himself. Well, Shediac is only 26 kilometers from Moncton. For our American listeners, that's 16 miles. Back then, it took about a 2.5-hour drive by horse to get there, although significantly less if you went by train and significantly more if you walked. The reporter soon discovered that tracking Timothy McCarthy's movements on the day he disappeared was significantly more difficult than he had anticipated writing.
Inquiries instituted in Shediac yesterday show that Timothy McCarthy went through by rail to Shediac by the noon train of the 12th of October, intending to cross to the island. On reaching Shediac, finding that the steamer would not leave that day on account of stormy weather, he returned to Moncton by train, harnessing his horse, and drove back to Shediac, leaving Moncton at 5 p.m.
Early on in his investigation, it seems to dawn on reporter George Sumner that there's more to this story than meets the eye. He, early on, abruptly changes his writing style from summarizing his findings for his readers, like reporters do then and now, to instead publishing, word for word, what the people he spoke to during his investigation told him. I don't think I can even emphasize just how extremely unconventional this is for the time, but it seems to imply that George Sumner, even that early on, was under the impression that perhaps what he was investigating might end up as part of a police investigation or a court trial. And the way that he summarized these people's direct quotes for us offers us this unique first-hand account to piece together what happened. So George Sumner took his horse to Shediac from Moncton, and he went to Weldon House, which is an inn and bar in Shediac where Timothy McCarthy stayed the night he went missing. He rode his horse into the stables, and the first person that he spoke to in Shediac was William Richards. And George Sumner wrote down his first interview.
I am the hostler of the Weldon House stables. About 9:30 o'clock, 12 October, Timothy McCarthy drove into the yard at Weldon House. It was a very dark night and raining very hard. I immediately put his horse in the barn. He said he would be back and went to a bar. I took his black felt hat and rubber hood that he forgot in the stable into the barroom at that time. McCarthy was in the barroom at that time. I did not see him after.
After leaving his horse in the stables, George Sumner went into Weldon House, which was the most prominent and luxurious hotel in Shediac. In the busy summer tourist season, this white, 3-story building was a popular destination, which played host to many wealthy and well-known guests, including, recently, none other than Prime Minister John A. Macdonald. However, on the stormy October night, when Timothy McCarthy disappeared, summer tourist season was long over. Shediac was effectively a ghost town during the low season, and the night Timothy McCarthy disappeared, he had been the only guest staying at Weldon House. Reporter George Sumner walked into the bar and he found it was a luxurious room with dark wooden floors and chandeliers hanging from its high ceilings. He approached the bartender named Martin MacDonald, who told him,
The first I saw of McCarthy was about 9:30 p.m. He asked me to let the hostler take particular good care of his horse. He did not know how long he would leave the horse. He did not say where he was going, but I did thought from the general conversation he was going to the island. He had on a black felt hat and I think a rubber coat. He left after that. I did not see him afterwards.
The reporter learned that bartender Martin MacDonald had gone home shortly after Timothy McCarthy had arrived. So he next spoke to Harry Osborne, who was not only another bartender at Weldon House, but he was also the son of its owner. Aside from their one guest that evening, the only other people staying in the hotel that night was a single servant who lived there named Annie Parker, and the Osborne family themselves, which included John, who was the owner, Martha, who was his wife, and their 2 adult children, Harry and Eliza Osborne. Harry Osborne told the reporter,
Timothy McCarthy came into our bar room about 9:30 o'clock. He was alone, got nothing to drink, remained there until about 10 o'clock. I seen him go to the bar room, to the front door, and go out. I did not see him after.
The reporter next spoke to John Osborne, the owner of the Weldon House Bar and Hotel, who said,
I was sick the night of October 12th. I was sick in my bed for 7 weeks with the typhoid fever. I heard McCarthy talking that night with my family in my front room. I think my wife came to bed at 11 o'clock, but I cannot say for certain. I have no certainty as to the time. Slept a little that night after McCarthy came to my home. I do not know what time he left my home. I slept that night.
The next person George Sumner interviewed was Eliza Osborne, the daughter of the owner of Weldon House, who had also been present that night, and she told him,
Timothy McCarthy came into our hotel 12th October last, about 9 o'clock p.m. From about 9 to 10 o'clock, that girl Annie Parker, the servant, was scrubbing the floors. He appeared quite sober. He asked me if his wife was there. I said no and asked him if she was over. He said yes, that he had left her at the point in the afternoon, but he thought she had come up here. He said his wife was watching him. He said that he went to Moncton on the train and drove his horse back, and that he was going to take the horse and wagon to the island, and that if his wife could catch him after he got over there, then she would have to be pretty smart. He said that she had undertaken to watch him, but that he thought he could defeat her. Most of the time I was talking to McCarthy was in the front room. My mother was in and out of the room while we talked. I don't know if McCarthy went to the bar room. I heard McCarthy go out at 10 o'clock. I went to bed at 10:30. I left the Parker girl in the kitchen when I went to bed. She said that ugly old had gone out and trampled my clean floor. I was not out of my bedroom from the time I went to bed until the next morning. I was not out of my bed that night.
Eliza told the reporter that the servant girl she kept mentioning, Annie Parker, didn't know anything more than what she'd already told him, so George Sumner didn't bother speaking to her. Intrigued by Eliza's emphasis on how Timothy McCarthy's wife had been watching him, how his wife had been following him, how he and his wife had a heated public argument earlier the day of his disappearance on the ferry wharf at Pointe de Chêne, and then how later on that night he had disappeared, the reporter thought that he should probably investigate the wife. George Sumner went back to Moncton to track down Timothy McCarthy's wife. He did this by going directly to her house and knocking on the door. He found that Mrs. McCarthy refused to speak to him. After further investigation, George Sumner learned that the wife had not gone home after the incident where she had a big shouting match with her husband on the ferry wharf right before he disappeared. But instead, she herself had disappeared right afterwards for nearly a week. So, George Sumner kept investigating this thread. He continued to ask around about Mrs. McCarthy's whereabouts right after the fight with her husband on the dock and his disappearance, and her own mysterious disappearance for 5 days. He learned that after this public fight with her husband, Mrs. McCarthy had not gone home, but she'd gone to stay with a friend who lived really close to the Pointe de Chêne wharf, and her name was Mrs. Brown. The reporter went to Mrs. Brown's house in Pointe de Chêne, near the ferry terminal. He found that Mrs. Brown was more than willing to explain the McCarthy's marital problems to him, which he then published in the newspaper for everyone to read.
Miss McCarthy came to our house in Pointe de Chêne on the 12th of October and remained with us for 5 days. She told me there were difficulties between her and her husband involving women, money, and gambling, and that he had told her when he got away that she would not find him easily. She was over here to watch him. He had taken a large sum of their money to go to the island to bet on horses. She said that after she saw him, McCarthy had gone home on the train. She did not go home and instead came here to stay with me for several days. She did not know until 5 days after she had come to our house that McCarthy had left his house again.
It It seems that Timothy McCarthy was not only an unfaithful husband, but had something of a gambling problem. Just before he disappeared, he had taken a large sum of money, and he had been en route to Prince Edward Island to gamble by betting on horses. His wife had caught up with him on the docks while he'd waited for the ferry, and she had confronted him. After their public argument on the docks, she then stormed off, staying with her friends for 5 days. The Brown family claimed that Mrs. McCarthy did not leave their house for those 5 days, giving her an airtight alibi. So, finding that the Mrs. McCarthy line of thought was a dead end, George Sumner next went to the staff on the ferry terminal. Apparently there was no privacy concerns about talking to a reporter back then, because the staff just let him look over their passenger lists. It turned out that the ferry that Timothy McCarthy had been waiting for had been cancelled after a large storm came in. The reporter summarized his findings for his readers.
On the 12th of October, Timothy McCarthy left home and has not been seen since that night. The boat left early the next morning, but Mr. McCarthy was not among the passengers. He stayed at Weldon House that night. He had a large sum of money on his person. He was also in Weldon House's bar room that night. Since then, nothing has been seen of him.
The mysterious disappearance of the well-known bar owner Timothy McCarthy from the economically depressed village of Moncton set the rumor mill on fire amongst all 600 of its inhabitants. Interestingly though, the general consensus in Moncton was not in fact that something bad had happened to Timothy McCarthy, but rather the widespread assumption was that he had left on his own accord. People didn't assume the worst, but instead assumed that he had simply abandoned his wife. They'd assumed that Timothy McCarthy had taken the money and he'd skipped town to start a new life elsewhere, likely with another woman. It seemed that his, how can we phrase this? His behavior with women was quite well known. This theory that he had abandoned his wife and started over elsewhere was widely accepted by pretty much everyone, including, by this point, our intrepid investigative reporter, George Sumner. Even one of the missing man's own brothers, Stephen McCarthy, came to believe this theory that his brother had run away. However, he later stated that he himself only came to believe this theory after visiting Weldon House and speaking to the Osborne family for himself.
I believed myself that the man had run away. I had conversations with Martha Osborne, the wife of the owner of Weldon House, since Tim's disappearance. The impression she conveyed to me was that Tim had run away from his wife and family. I never knew Tim and the Osbornes to quarrel. They had been quite friendly for 4 years now. Never heard any hard words pass between them. I now, in view of subsequent observances, think that, in conversation, the Osbornes used a certain amount of policy to prevent me from searching for a body, in the same way as Edward did.
While Stephen McCarthy might have given up on finding his brother Timothy McCarthy, another brother of the missing man, Edward McCarthy, never gave up searching. He never believed the gossip that his brother had skipped town to abandon his wife, and it was Edward who first wrote up that newspaper ad looking for his missing brother, that same ad that we started with, which encouraged reporter George Sumner to investigate. Even after most people had given up, including that very reporter, Edward McCarthy did not, and he continued to visit Shediac looking for clues about what happened to his brother. 2 months after Timothy McCarthy went missing, Edward was still on the search and he was still going back to Shediac. It is by now early December, and Edward McCarthy once again arrives in Shediac to look for clues alone. His hunt for clues had turned up nothing until this point, but this trip would be different. A local man named Philippe Cormier had heard of Edward's persistent search, and he went to meet him. Philippe Cormier had found something strange around the time of Timothy McCarthy's disappearance. But after hearing that the missing man had probably just run off, he hadn't really given it much more thought. However, when Philippe Cormier kept hearing these stories about the brother who wouldn't give up, it inspired him to dig up what he had found. And that was a black felt hat. Philippe Cormier gave the hat to Edward, and he told him,
I found it on the river on the 20th or 21st of October, on the station side of the river, a little above what is known as Oak Point, near which there is said to be very deep water. I tried it on, but it was too big. I put it on a shelf and did not think of it again.
Edward McCarthy immediately recognized the hat. It had belonged to his missing brother, Timothy McCarthy. Over the next 2 days, local authorities began to search the Squiduk River, near where the black felt hat was found. It was getting into mid-December, and they battled increasing ice, as well as sunken logs and slabs of rock as they searched. Then a body was pulled out of the bottom of the river. It was in a particularly deep spot of the Squiduk River, tied in rope, which was attached to a rock. The rock the body was tied to was distinctive. And some of the search and rescue people noticed this rock because they'd recognized it. It had long been used to hold the door open of the bar in Weldon House. As soon as the body was pulled out of the river, the cause of death was clear: a heavy blow to the back of the head. This was definitely a murder. The body was remarkably well preserved, presumably from the cold water, and was instantly recognized. It was Timothy McCarthy. A magistrate was dispatched to investigate the murder. First thing he did was go to Weldon House, which was where the murder victim had last been seen. On December 4th, the magistrate informally spoke to the servant working at the hotel, whose name was Annie Parker. She was 17 years old, and she not only worked, but also lived in Weldon House, sleeping in a tiny room above the bar in the building.
I was at the Osborne House in Shediac on the evening of the 12th October last past. I know this. I found Timothy McCarthy in the parlor at 9 o'clock. I heard him talking with Eliza Osborne. They were talking about Mrs. McCarthy following Mr. McCarthy to Pointe du Chêne, and about a dress McCarthy was to get for a girl. Eliza Osborne told McCarthy she had no money to bet. This was about the dress he had got for a girl. He pulled out a roll of bills. She did not care if it was black or white buttons on the dress. She would not bet. At 10 o'clock, he went to the bar and got a drink and went out. I went to bed at 11 o'clock. A week later, I found a roll of bills on the top of an old cupboard in the kitchen. I did say I would not say any more than the Osbornes would. Eliza cried when she heard you were coming to the house. I refuse to tell anything more that I know about the matter.
Annie Parker quickly scurried away, refusing to say anything more to the magistrate. In a rather unusual move on the police part, the magistrate shared this young servant girl's unusual statement to him with reporter George Sumner, who promptly published the entire thing verbatim in the newspaper. This unusual development raised many more questions than it offered answers. Martha Osborne, who was the wife of the owner of Weldon House and the mother of Eliza and Harry Osborne, attempted to squash this speculation that Annie Parker's statement appearing in the newspaper brought up by writing her own statement and sending it to George Sumner. Of course, as he's doing with everything, George Sumner promptly published this entire thing verbatim in his newspaper. So we're going to give you right now the entire statement that Martha Osborne wrote him with the intention, let's say, of proving her innocence.
I, Martha Osborne, keep the Weldon Hotel in Shediac. I recollect the night Timothy McCarthy came to our home. When McCarthy came into our house, my daughter Eliza was playing the piano, and he commenced dancing, and then sat down asking if Mrs. McCarthy was there. Eliza asked him if Mrs. McCarthy was coming here. He said that she came over to watch him, but that he didn't think that she would make it out this time. He had bought the Wilbur racer and was going to take the horse and carriage to the island, and when he got there, he intended to take the first good-looking woman or girl he could get. I then went out to the kitchen. When I returned to the room, McCarthy and Eliza were having an argument about an overskirt, about the buttons on it. He said, "Damn that overskirt. I have heard nothing about that overskirt for a week back home." She said she saw the girl with the dress on. He asked if he would bet $1 that there was not white buttons on it. She said, "I don't care whether they were black or white." As near as I can recollect, Eliza went out of the room. I then left the room. My son Harry took him for a drink at the bar, and then he went out. I think McCarthy was only in our house that night for an hour. Eliza went to bed after McCarthy went out. Harry locked the bar door, put the key on the kitchen table, and then went to bed. The bar was locked up a little past 10 o'clock that night, I think. When I went to my bedroom, I went to bed. I am positive it was not later than 10:30 o'clock when I went to bed that night. A wagon might have gone out that night, and we may not have heard it. It had rained and the ground was wet and soft. I have no acquaintance with Timothy McCarthy. I never knew him.
Now, there's a lot going on in Martha Osborne's statement. And one thing that kind of stands out to us is Martha Osborne claimed there that she didn't know Timothy McCarthy. Now that doesn't line up with what his brother had said, that the family and Timothy had known one another for 4 years. But I think probably the reddest of the red flags in there is Martha Osborne's statement that came totally out of nowhere, that there was a wagon that may or may not have departed that night. Because up to this point, nobody had ever said anything about a wagon leaving in the night. This doesn't appear to have been lost on the magistrate, who, as soon as Martha Osborne's letter was published, immediately returned to Weldon House to again interview Annie Parker. The first time he interviewed Annie Parker, she was just speaking casually with him in a corridor when he cornered her in Weldon House. This time, it was a formal questioning, and Annie Parker was under oath.
I, Annie Parker, do solemnly declare that on the 12th day of October last that I was residing as a servant girl in the licensed tavern kept by John Osborne at Shediac. I am 17 years of age. I was born in the city of Quebec, and our folks moved to Dalhousie 9 or 10 years ago. I came to Moncton last May. On the night of the 12th of October at 9 o'clock, Timothy McCarthy came into the tavern and went into the parlor with Martha Osborne and Eliza Osborne. He conversed with them some time about some girl, and they got to talking quite loud. Eliza Osborne told him about seeing this girl in Moncton with white buttons on her dress. He said it was none of her business, it was his own affair. A question then arose about the color of the buttons. He said they were black. She said they were white. He offered her to bet $10 that they were black. She replied he had no money. He said he had and pulled out a roll of bank bills. She said she did not care if the buttons were black or white. She would not bet with him. He said that he intended to go to the island with his horse and carriage. He said there was no road or street on the island which he would not go over. He said he would pick up the best looking girl he could find. She then went into the kitchen. He went to the bar, took a drink, and left the house. He then had on a rubber suit, coat, and cap as he passed over the floor, which I just cleaned. I said to him, "You look like an old woman with that rubber suit on." I never saw McCarthy afterwards. At 12 o'clock, as the clock was striking, I heard a man come in the front door. After that man came in, I heard him talking in the bar room, and I am almost certain it was Timothy McCarthy. There were then in the bar room Martha Osborne, Eliza Osborne, and Harry Osborne, besides the man who came in. I heard talking to about 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. I heard Mrs. McCarthy's name often mentioned. Between 2 and 3 o'clock, I heard Martha Osborne tell Harry to go put horses on the wagon. About 10 minutes before the wagon was ordered, I heard talking in the bar room in which the man supposed to be McCarthy was taking part. I heard heavy breathing a little before the horse was ordered. At 3 o'clock, I heard a noise they made. I checked the clock. I came downstairs. I heard the wagon come by the front door. I heard several persons pass from the barroom to the door. I know it was Martha Osborne and Eliza from their step and their voice. I saw the wagon driving away from the door. I was looking from my bedroom window. It went down towards the stream mill. I knew the horse and wagon. It was Osborne's. I saw one person sitting in the seat. I think it was Harry. Saw something in the back of the wagon. The wagon returned in about half an hour. I was in bed.
Shortly after delivering that statement, the magistrate left Weldon House. Annie Parker, though, did not leave Weldon House because, remember, she lived there. So the magistrate left, Annie Parker stayed there. That same night, Annie Parker disappeared. The next day, Annie Parker popped up in Moncton, where she had walked all night to get to, showing up at the house of Edward McCarthy, who was the brother who had never given up searching. Annie Parker revealed to Edward that she knew much more about what happened than she had earlier let on, but she refused to say so because Harry Osborne had made her swear on a Bible never to reveal anything more than what the Osbornes themselves had already told the authorities. Annie claimed that the night before she had spoken to the magistrate in the evening, and then the magistrate had left. Later that same evening, she observed Martha Osborne, the mother, mix a white powder into a drink and give it to her. Annie Parker pretended to drink it and then fled Weldon House into the night shortly after. She told Edward that because of the vow Harry had made her take on the Bible, she still hadn't revealed everything she knew to the magistrate. She told him that when she went down the stairs that night, she not only heard what was going on in the room, like she told the magistrate, but she had also peeked in, and she had seen what happened next for herself. Annie Parker took her vow that Harry had made her take on the Bible, not saying anything more, very seriously, but Annie Parker took Martha Osborne's attempt to poison her even more seriously, and in her opinion, the attempt to murder her made the vow she had taken on the Bible null and void. And now she felt that she could reveal the whole story. Unfortunately, I wasn't actually able to find a verbatim copy of Annie Parker's third statement. This rather key piece of information seems to be the only thing that wasn't taken down directly. But instead, I'll just give you what George Sumner summarized about her third statement. And this is what he published in the Times, saying that Annie Parker had said.
The girl now alleges that Timothy McCarthy went into the barroom of the Osborne house about midnight of October 12th. She went downstairs soon after and found all of the Osborne family except for the father in the barroom with McCarthy. She saw Martha Osborne put a white powder in a glass of pale brandy she was preparing for McCarthy, and that after he drank it, he grew stupid. She said that while in this condition, he was robbed of his money by the Osbornes, and soon after, struck in the head with a hatchet by Harry Osborne, acting by his mother's orders, until he was dead, 2 blows being necessary to produce death. She said that when dead, he was stripped of his coat, and a cord placed around his neck, and a heavy stone brought in and attached to the other end of the cord. That the body was carried to the wagon, the mother and daughter having the shoulders and the son the legs. By Martha Osborne's orders, she wiped and scraped up the blood on the barroom floor and along the hall to the front door.
Well, George Sumner sarcastically complained that
this was the 50th version of Annie Parker's story so far.
He also noted that although Annie Parker had been omitting some details when she still lived with the Osbornes, the 3 different versions of the story she'd now told lined up, and he emphasized that Annie Parker had not lied. She'd omitted certain things, but she hadn't actually lied about anything. And he urged his readers to
give careful consideration to what she said.
It certainly appears that the authorities believed Annie Parker's statement, though, because at 11 o'clock that same night, a judge issued a warrant for the arrest of John, Martha, Eliza, and Harry Osborne. The magistrate in Moncton quickly deputized a team of marshals, and they immediately rode off in the night for Shediac. Somewhat inexplicably, the team of marshals and the magistrate also brought along Edward McCarthy, the brother who'd never given up. The marshals, accompanied by McCarthy, rode along through the darkness to Shediac. They arrived in the dead of night, and they found the Osbornes packing up their wagons and their furniture. The marshals stormed into Weldon House, and this time using Annie Parker's statements, they looked a lot more closely than the magistrate had before. They noted that the floorboards Annie Parker said she had cleaned the blood off of had recently been replaced with new boards. They noticed that the bar she claimed had been dented by Timothy McCarthy's head hitting it when Harry struck him from behind was gone. They noted that the floorboards of the wagon Annie Parker claimed that the body had been transported in were all brand new. And they even found a rope with a piece missing, which matched that which Annie Parker claimed had been tied to Timothy McCarthy's body. The Osborne family were taken into custody without incident. The French folk song called Le Meurtre de Timothy McCarthy is part of a long tradition of telling stories through songs. While Newfoundland and Quebec's folk song traditions have enjoyed a popular resurgence and a good deal of academic interest in recent decades, the Maritimes have also had a long folk song tradition which has been, sadly, largely ignored. Le Meurtre de Timothy McCarthy was written in Memramcook, just outside of Moncton, by an Acadian blacksmith named Honoré Leblanc. He didn't have any special insider knowledge of this case. He wrote these lyrics, which are very detailed about the case, based on newspaper reports he read about during the trial of the Osborne family. He wouldn't have been reading George Sumner's reports in the Times, though, because he couldn't speak English. Instead, he would have followed along with the trial in the French newspaper Le Moniteur Acadien, which said of Annie Parker during the subsequent trial.
Nothing disconcerts her, nothing embarrasses her, nothing surprises her. The spirit of observation of this youth is a supreme fact. The most minute details did not escape her observation. She told, she wrote everything, the places, the distances, the positions, the outfits. For every question, she has a response ready. From the first words of the lawyers, she has a response ready. And extraordinarily, for a person without any training or experience, never answers anything more than she needs to answer, and never contradicts herself.
However, that Acadian newspaper noted that Annie Parker
speaks French very easily, but her English is incorrect, and she keeps the French accent.
The trial was conducted in English, and the judge and the jury were also all English. Honoré Leblanc wrote the song Le Meurtre de Timothy McCarthy as a tragedy. The tragedy to him was that the murderers escaped justice because the judge and jury at that trial had discriminated against Annie Parker because she was Acadian. Annie Parker's birth name was Anne Peltier. She had changed her name and she moved to a different place in order to escape systemic discrimination against Acadians. Nobody had questioned Annie Parker's statements when they were reading her words in English in newspapers, but when they heard her speak during the trial with her thick French accent, and they learned that she had been born as Anne Peltier, suddenly Anglophones began to question everything she said. There were actually 3 long and grueling back-to-back trials, which lasted a grand total of 3 years. Each day of these proceedings appeared in detail in the front pages of newspapers all over Canada and much of the United States. Systemic discrimination and prejudice against Acadians and French-speaking Canadians was high at the time. However, as English speakers read daily newspaper reports of Annie Parker's calm and collected and sharp and intelligent testimony over and over, they began to side with her. The public became outraged by this blatant bragging that the Osborne family would make that they would get off. And this included the father, John Osborne, straight up declaring on the stand that they would be found innocent because they spent $5,000 to hire 2 high-powered Toronto lawyers to defend them. That was declared on the stand. And these 2 Toronto lawyers, they viciously attacked Annie Parker on the stand. They constantly mocked her impoverished upbringing in Dalhousie. They attacked her last name before she changed it, was Peltier. And for her part, Annie Parker seemed totally unfazed by these personal attacks. And realistically, this probably wasn't the first time she'd experienced this sort of discrimination. But her genteel English-speaking newspaper readers in faraway places like Ontario and Boston didn't understand this, and they were genuinely shocked with the way she was being treated. The first trial ended with the jury being unable to agree on a verdict. Another lengthy trial was held, and again, the jury could not agree on a verdict. So it's now been 2 years of 2 lengthy, 2 expensive court cases, and at this point the prosecution gave up and they abandoned this case. But there was still a third trial because after this, the Osbornes launched a lawsuit against Annie Parker for slander. Now, by this point, the public had been reading about Annie Parker in the newspaper for 2 years. They felt that they knew her quite well on a personal level because she'd been on the front page of the newspaper so often, and they'd also come to like her. And they had certainly come to dislike the Osbornes based on newspaper coverage. And the public was quite horrified that this young woman was being attacked like this again and sued after all she had gone through. The courts ultimately agreed because they found that there was no merit on the slander allegations and the lawsuit was thrown out. So after 3 years since the trial, everything is finally over. Annie Parker emerges from all of this as a sympathetic figure who, in the eyes of the public, if apparently not the jury's, had been unfairly attacked for trying to do the right thing. She emerged from all of this to find herself to be quite famous and popular amongst English speakers across Canada and the United States. Annie Parker cashed in on this by launching a speaking tour talking about what she had gone through to audiences all over Canada and the United States. It turned out to be quite popular. It turned out to be quite a moneymaker for her. If you guys remember really early on, one of our first episodes, Oscar Wilde's speaking tour of the Maritimes, this was around the same time. He was criticized for his high ticket prices of 50 cents a ticket. Annie Parker, this is a couple years earlier, also charged 50 cents a ticket. So after all she went through, she came out pretty okay. You know who also came out okay was the Osbornes. They went back to running their hotel and bar in Shediac. They were not punished by the law at all. And there was no kind of karmic comeuppance or anything like that either. Actually, quite the opposite, in fact. While the murder trial was going on, there was a catastrophic fire that broke out in Shediac. This is the Great Fire of Shediac. Basically, the entirety of Shediac burned to the ground. Everything burned to the ground. There were only 2 buildings in Shediac that did not burn to the ground. One of them was Weldon House. The Acadian folk song Le Moutre de Timothy McCarthy ends with a warning to the listener to avoid Weldon House Bar and Inn, because the same thing that happened to Timothy McCarthy could happen to you.
That was Backyard History with your host, Andrew McLean. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for another hidden story that happened in your own backyard. produced by Jordan Lozier.